So, good morning, everyone. A couple of weeks ago, I attended a conference at the University of Pittsburgh. The acronym for the conference was DANS, it's Developmental Affective Neuroscience. And I gave a talk there, but the speakers, by and large, on this conference were neuroscientists who do intervention work. And they do intervention work with children. University of Pittsburgh, in particular, has a very strong child psychiatry department. And the first talk of the conference was by a rather well-known child psychiatrist by the name of Neil Ryan, maybe known to some of you. And his talk was about why the interventions that we currently do for children with anxiety disorders, with depression, why they don't work for everyone. In fact, the data that he showed, and some of the data that I'm going to show you, shows that in fact there's a rather large percentage of children who are administered traditional, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy, or even drugs for particular disorders, that simply these treatments don't work. And my talk this morning is really to try and answer that question. So here's the issue that I think is not only before clinical psychologists and neuroscientists who are interested in intervention, but for all of us here in the room, which is that most intervention studies that we heard about yesterday from Jack and from Phil, they only have small to modest effect sizes. And that's because there are often as many, if not more, non-responders to the intervention as there are responders. But we really don't know why it is that some children respond and some children don't. And that particular issue has stymied our ability to advance the agenda that we all want, which is to have effective, scaled-up interventions for children. So where might we look for the reasons that some children respond and others don't? I'm only going to talk about two broad areas this morning. One of them is individual differences in temperament, and I'll explain to you exactly what temperament is and what that means. And the other is history of adverse events. So let me start with the second, actually, first. These are actually data that Neil Ryan showed in his talk, and he was kind enough to give me this slide. It's a study that David Brent, who is another fairly well-known child psychiatrist, his study at the University of Pittsburgh, and they were looking to see about the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, for children with depression. And what they found, see if this works, yeah, there we go. You can see the orange bar are the children that got CBT. The blue bar are children that did not get CBT. They got some other intervention. But what's most important is just to compare the two orange bars. These are children who have no history of abuse, and these are children who do have a history of abuse. And what's clear is that children with a history of abuse, there are many more non-responders, children who don't benefit from that intervention. Now, you may ask the question, well, okay, why is that? Why is it that children with a history of abuse don't respond as well to cognitive behavioral therapy? I'm not sure if everybody knows what cognitive behavioral therapy is, but it is exactly what it sounds like. Cognitive, meaning there's a lot of talking and thinking about, visualizing about the situation that you're in, and behavioral, you're put into different types of behavioral situations. Anxiety, you might be put into a social group and so forth and so on. So why is it that CBT doesn't work or doesn't work as well for children with abuse? Well, we can look to the brain science for an answer for that. This is a study that was published in 2009, and it shows what are the effects of corporal punishment, physical abuse, on the development of an area in the brain called the prefrontal cortex. I believe Stephanie told you a little bit about that area yesterday as being that area that's very important for executive functions. Well, this area in the brain is significantly affected by a history of abuse. And given the importance of this area for executive function, cognitive behavioral therapy is simply not going to work as well. And so there we have an underlying mechanism for why this history of abuse may in fact lead to non-response to this, what seemingly is this very effective intervention therapy for anxiety and depression. Okay, how about temperament? So we define temperament as the differences in the quality and intensity of a young child's reaction to different events. We think that it's present early in life, that it's heritable. Doesn't mean that it's genetic necessarily, but it's heritable, meaning that the correlation between identical twins is higher than it is among fraternal twins, and that it's pretty stable over the first years of life, and also that it forms the basis for adult personality. So in thinking about how to tell you about temperament, I decided I would give a personal example. So I'm trained as a developmental psychologist, and this is who I thought I would be when my first child was born. I don't know if any of you know who that is. That's B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner is the father of learning, operant conditioning. And he believed that it would be possible to take, well, he worked with pigeons and rats, but there's the story about his daughter being raised in the Skinner box. He believed that with the principles of learning, reward and holding back reward, that you could shape behavior. And I thought, hey, here's my new daughter. I'm going to be the B.F. Skinner of parents. Well, luckily for her, her sib came soon after. And then I thought, well, I'm going to go to these guys. Know who they are? Watson and Crick. Okay? Jack talked to you about James Watson and Francis Crick. Those are the ones who discovered DNA and genes. And so then I went from being the guy who thought that everything would be about learning to the guy who thought that everything would be about genes. Well, in fact, it's neither, right? And it really is about understanding who the child is. So when we talk about temperament, we talk about two dimensions. One of them is reactivity, and it's dimensional. It goes from children who fuss and respond negatively to new situations. They take a long time, these children take a long time to develop relationships with new adults. And they generally want to be close to their caregivers and are scared fearful of new situations. On the other spectrum are children who we call temperamentally exuberant. These are kids who enjoy being in new situations. They're quick and eager to explore the environment. They seek out other people and interact with them. They smile a lot. We all know a lot of those people, right? So along that dimension of reactivity, different children lay in terms of their temperament. But there's another dimension. Actually, this is really the brilliance of a developmental psychologist by the name of Mary Rothbart, who articulated this idea about temperament some 30 years ago. At first, we thought that temperament was just there in terms of this reactivity when you're born, and that's it. But what Mary argued and convinced the field about is that there's another dimension of temperament, and we call that self-regulation. And self-regulation develops over the first years of life, and even into the preschool years. So temperament is a dynamically unfolding construct, a dynamically unfolding situation for the child. Now, what does it mean? What is self-regulation? Well, it's what Stephanie mentioned to you earlier yesterday in terms of the skills that are associated with it are executive functions, long-term planning, working memory, flexibility of attention, and also the ability to delay gratification and control impulses. Some of you may recognize that picture at the bottom there. That's, Walter Mischel has made a career, among other things, on the marshmallow test. How many of you don't know what the marshmallow test is? Okay, good, right? So the marshmallow test, that's great. The marshmallow test assesses in a young child their inhibitory control. And what Mischel has shown quite dramatically is that the development of that inhibitory control and individual differences in inhibitory control, in fact, are critically important in terms of the development of adaptive behavior, not only in the preschool years, not only in elementary school and high school, but even into adulthood. So he has remarkable data that come from his study and from Avshalom Caspi and their Dunedin study in New Zealand, in which they show that differences in inhibitory control in childhood are related to adaptive behavior in adulthood. So, what do we know about these two temperamental characteristics, reactivity and regulation, in terms of the effects of adversity on children in terms of this temperament? So there are a couple of things that I want to point out here in this schematic or image of the brain. The first is, I circled it in blue there, those are the areas deep in the brain that are associated with reactivity. They're there at birth. They are operating at birth. The amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, those areas deep in the brain, and they are responsible for reactivity to novelty and unfamiliarity, and differences in their activity are associated with these individual differences that I've told you about in reactivity. The other area that is critically important, I've already mentioned it, is the prefrontal cortex. The development of that area is critical for the development of self-regulation. But now, here's the important point about that second area. So I already told you that that first area is present at birth. The second area, the prefrontal cortex, matures over the preschool years, and even, some people believe, even through up to and including adolescence. So if that's the case, let's think about the effects of adversity, of early experience on these two brain areas, right? The first thing that you would say is that for those structures that are deep in the brain, experience that occur to infants and young children in the first years of life are going to be critical in terms of affecting these areas. Now, for the prefrontal cortex, we can say that that window in which the effects of adversity are going to have a negative effect on development is going to be wider, because that area of the brain is more plastic and is developing over time, over this protracted period of time. And so, in fact, infants who are highly reactive, their prefrontal cortices if they experience adversity in those early years of life, they're not going to be able to downregulate that reactivity that they have, which is heightened as a function of early stress, of early toxic stress. So, how can we facilitate the development of self-regulation, executive function, and reduce the impact of toxic stress on young children? There are a couple of ways that we can do this for both reactivity and regulation. So first, in terms of reactivity, if you have a highly reactive infant or young child, it's difficult, right? Because they don't respond easily to soothing. They don't respond easily to the kinds of things that we would think would naturally calm down any baby. So it's important that parents set firm, appropriate limits on their children's behavior, and that they help their child practice coping skills. And here's the hard one: respond sensitively, but not solicitously if their children are reactive. Let me give you just one quick example, because in terms of explaining to you what I mean by that. I study a group of children who are highly reactive. We spend a lot of time tracking these children over development. These are children that are scared, they're fearful of novelty and unfamiliarity, they cry, they are not really receptive to other adults and to the typical kinds of things that parents or caregivers can do to calm them. So when we observe parents working or interacting with their children, we see basically two different styles. One style we see for these temperamentally fearful and scared children are parents who are over-solicitous, who are overly concerned and cautious about working with their child. The other style is to respond sensitively, but not be overcautious, not be over-solicitous with your child. And which one do you think leads to the better outcome? Well, in fact, it's the one in which the parent is less solicitous, less overcautious, sensitive to the child's needs, but still creating a context and a situation, flexible context and situation where that child can grow. How about self-regulation? What are the ways in which we can facilitate and foster self-regulation skills in young children? Well, you've heard a little bit about that from Stephanie's talk yesterday evening, so I'll just go over this list pretty quickly. The area of the brain that is supporting self-regulation is this area called the prefrontal cortex. And in the prefrontal cortex, we have underlying that and related to that are the skills that are associated with executive function and thinking and representational thinking. So, teaching children strategies of attention regulation and cognitive reframing are important ways of doing that. But how do you do that? So there are ways to practice self-control. I put up a couple here. Simon Says, red light, green light. Those are all good ways in which parents and caregivers and teachers can work with children to enhance self-control. The third is to practice or provide scaffolded experiences of self-control. So what do I mean by that? The idea of scaffolding is one that Vygotsky, who was a Russian developmental psychologist, first introduced to the developmental world, and it has to do with providing a context and an environment in which the child can develop in their own way. And so providing experiences which scaffold that self-control is one important means for developing self-regulation in children. And finally, the most difficult one, is to model self-control yourself. Children learn from us. We are the models from whom they learn how to talk to people, how to interact with people, how to deal with situations, and how to deal with stress. So in that way, parents are critically important in terms of their ability to control their behavior and to have self-control. And in that way, they model self-control for their children. One last point about temperament that I'll raise here is one that was originally proposed by Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess, and it's this idea of goodness of fit. And I'll simply say just one point about it, which is psychologists used to think that what Thomas and Chess meant by goodness of fit is that if my temperament is like my child's temperament, then we fit. Well, that's really not what this is about. What it's about is parents being flexible for different children with different temperaments. Caregivers being flexible with children with different temperaments, and teachers being flexible with children with different temperaments. One size does not fit all. And in that way, it's critically important that we recognize that from the get-go, children are individuals, and that we treat them and interact with them as individuals. Okay, so my conclusions. Intervention studies examine the effects of programs on large groups of children with the hope that one size fits all. But as you heard yesterday, and as I'm trying to tell you today, that's not the case. Infants and children and adults differ from one another, and these differences are important in terms of their reactions, self-regulation, and learning. When we interact with people, even in this wonderful group here, we don't interact in the same way with every person. We interact with them and pick up on their cues and on their personality and on their style. And that's really what temperament is about, and it's why understanding these individual differences is so important in terms of understanding why some children respond and some children don't. And finally, taking into account individual differences and the emergence of self-regulation will be an important next step in crafting individual approaches for intervention. Now, I wanted to end with a personal remark here. As Jim mentioned, I am a founding member and current member of the National Council for the Developing Child. I've been with Jack for many years. And when FOI started, at every dinner there, Jack would say, "We've got to get you involved in FOI. We've got to get you involved in FOI." Well, I was a skeptic and didn't really understand what FOI was. But one dinner, I don't know if you remember this, Jack, one dinner we were sitting around and someone asked me what my most recent research was on. And I was telling them about this intervention that we were doing in my lab, developing a attention training intervention for adults with anxiety and for children with anxiety. And Jack said, "That's it. You're going to be part of FOI." And I am. So just very briefly, we have a attention training intervention. We've done 3 RCTs, randomized controlled trials, with this intervention, in which we train a child, an adolescent, or an adult's attention away from threat. It's a computer task. The computer task takes about 10 to 15 minutes, and we administer it twice a week for 4 weeks. And you can see there in this figure, this is a hot off the presses, it's actually under review RCT that we did with adolescents who were diagnosed with social anxiety. And you can see there that there are two lines. One of them is the children are divided up based upon whether or not they have high or low attention control. Now, our bet was that kids would benefit most from this intervention if they had high attention control. Because after all, we were training attention. But like all good science, or like most science, at least in my lab, when we make a hypothesis, we're usually wrong. But when we're wrong, it tells us something. And so what you could see here is that it was actually the children who were low in attention control who were the ones who benefited most from the intervention. Now, the ones with high attention control benefited as well, but the low attention control kids benefited more. And that's interesting. And it tells us that if a child is high in attention control, giving them this intervention is sort of piling on something that they already have. And maybe we should be tweaking it differently for them than we do for the kids who are low in attention control, who are benefiting most. Anyway, we've taken this information and with Jason Gortney and the folks at Washington State in Vancouver, Washington, we are starting a micro trial of attention training with children and hopefully adults in their clinic there. And it is exciting for me because I flew out there to set up the situation, and I met with Jason and the staff. And in the day that I was there, I learned more about the intervention than I had from 3 RCTs in the lab that I had in my own experimental situation. Because this was real, this was in the field, and real life. And I think that's what you all are involved in. And I think to that, my dinner with Jack back then, I give him credit for that. So with that, thank you very much.